Hi everyone, and welcome to my guide for the Poison Barrage build. This is something I've already talked about a while ago when I was playing this on the PTR. This was going to be my main build of the season. And man, now that I've actually played it and I have the full setup, it feels so much fun. So I really want to share this yet again with my new optimized version. This is something that a lot of people on my stream have been very excited about when I played it lately. A lot of people think this is really fun looking at it, and I gotta agree. This is the most fun build I've actually played in a long time, maybe ever actually. It really reminds of the Diablo 3 multi-shot Demon Hunter. This is a Barrage build with inner sight, no generators, no combo points. You just blast, you poison everything up with poison imbuement with a range build, which is very unusual, but it works out pretty well here. And man, it's just so much fun. It's not as powerful as like Heartseeker right now because of the double dipping that Victimize has. It's like a bit stronger than it should be. But you can see here I am cruising for those pit 80s on hardcore with my rogue. There are no problems. And this is pretty close to the farming tiers I was doing on Heartseeker, like almost the same actually. So it doesn't necessarily push as high if you want to go for like the highest clears on the leaderboard or something. But for farming, it is formidable. And as you go higher, it will just kind of like struggle a little bit more with the bosses as you go. Barrage is not really known for like the craziest boss damage output, but it works just fine. I kill most of them in like sub 30 seconds on this tier. And even going to like tier 105, 110 or so with this setup is pretty realistic, I would say, if you really want to try and push it. So overall, I'm having a great time playing this build. This is how I'm farming a lot of my Neve Iron right now in those pit 80s, 75s, 77s. Somewhere around that is just kind of like a very comfortable tier for me right now, and this is not 100% optimized yet. I have masterworked a bunch of items to like 10, 9, 1 or 2 to 12 even, but most of the stuff is like not super extraordinary. However, in order to play this final version of the build, you need two uber uniques. So one is the Starter Skies, the more important one, because this is a very resource hungry build. So you kind of need to have that in order to sustain the resources the way I do it. And the second one is Shaco, but this one is a bit more optional. You can't get away without it. The Starter Skies though is something that I'd really recommend to have before you play this version of the build. However, I do have a full Maxwell guide for this already. This is something I wrote before the season started, and it's the Death Trap Rogue Guide that we have on Maxroll. So usually this build starts out at a much lower entry level with a Death Trap setup that is the fuel and the energy recovery engine basically for this build. And later on you can transition, once you have the Starter Skies, you don't need the Death Trap anymore. You just play this with a full close quarter setup and have a lot more damage output. Before we continue with the video, I want to give a shout out to today's sponsor, boot.dev. They've created a platform that makes it easier than ever to get into programming and polish your skills. They believe that the easiest way to learn code is to make sure that you're never bored, and this is why they have designed their courses to feel more like a game and less like a chore. The only way to really get into programming is to get your hands busy and write a ton of code, and this is exactly what the tasks allow you to do without ever feeling like you're getting stuck, because they have tons of tools to help you out. In these courses, you're going to learn backend programming from start to finish in the Python and Go languages. You will earn XP, levels, achievements, and you can even rank on the global leaderboard if you really want to be competitive. And if you ever feel like you're stuck and you can't progress, they have Boots, the powerful bear wizard AI that helps you understand the problem and guides you towards a solution. Compared to attending a university course, boot.dev is a way cheaper solution and allows you the flexibility of doing it all at your own pace and from home. They offer both a monthly and annual subscription, and you can cancel in the first 30 days, no questions asked. So if you really want to learn coding and that convinces you, then go check out boot.dev with the link in the description or the pinned comment below, and you get 25% off your first payment to boot.dev by clicking that link or using my code. And now, let's go back to the video. So getting back into the setup here, we have the Death Trap Rogue Guide as I mentioned before. This is the build guide that you want to follow if you want to play this basically from a low level onwards. This guide will start at level 50 and then guide you all the way to this ultimate version. So the reason why this is the Death Trap guide is because we used Death Trap originally to fuel the energy. There are several ways to do that on the skill tree and with some effects that we can trigger. Most notably, we have Aftermath here that can give us resources. And we also can play with Preparation. And Preparation allows you to reset all of your skills when you use Death Trap, which is very easily done with the Exposure Key passive. So at the start, when you start out this build and you don't have starter skies, you don't have really good gear with resource cost reduction and so on, you play this and then you use a Death Trap like every few seconds. It resets extremely fast because of the insane lucky hits that you have, especially when you shoot into packs with Barrage. For example, with the branching volleys and with the high velocity, you get a lot of extra hits on your Barrage, a lot of lucky hits when you shoot into packs. So you trigger exposure very easily. So you kind of walk in, throw down a poison trap, you can do a Death Trap, everything gets pulled together, everything explodes, and you have all of your cooldowns ready again every time you press Death Trap with Preparation. So not only do you get the resources from Aftermath, but you also get them just from shooting with Innovation. And again, we have a lot of lucky hit. This triggers quite often, like multiple times per second, basically in a big pack. And then we have also Concealment that gives us the enhanced concealment, 40 energy. And you also can go with a Tybalt's Will. So this is kind of like an intermediate option here. This one gives you also resources when you become unstoppable, which you can do from the Concealment or even from the Shadow Step. So you could even think about, for example, dropping the Smoke Grenade and going for a Shadow Step so you have more unstoppable uses, for example. But depending on your progression state, this may be more or less necessary. And again, later on you transition to this Starless and Chakra setup once you have those two Uber uniques and you don't need any of the Death Trap stuff anymore. And in that case, you don't even need exposure anymore, and we go close quarters combat. So this is why the setup is so good, because now you can actually benefit from this damage multiplier. You get 30% extra attack speed and up to roughly double damage on top of it. So close quarters combat is just really a high damage boost, and this is what you want to play in the late game, and this is where the build really pops off. Before that, yeah, it's fine. You can definitely, blast through like tier 100 dungeons. You can even go pit, probably like 61 plus, farm that Neef Iron, but you want to work on those starter skies and Shaco uniques as soon as possible. There are multiple progression steps here in the guide as well. So you see here there's a Codex starter at level 50. So throughout the steps, the skill tree changes a little bit. We go from like, more energy recovery to less energy recovery basically as you acquire better gear. And then you have like the leveling set up to 100. And then the end game set up here, and then finally the starters and a Shaco version down there. And this is also a pretty universal version, so this kind of like does it all. You can do the bosses with this, you can do speed farming with this, you have dash and shadow step in there. It's very mobile, so it feels really good. And early on we have to do some concessions here. We can't really run as fast because we do need that concealment for the resources. And as I mentioned, maybe you can throw in like a shadow step there if you really want to. So that's kind of like up to you, but the final version is just like this all-around really great build that goes very fast. And how we do damage? Well, it's mostly for the poison imbuement. So usually poison imbuement is reserved for the melee builds in the rogue class, because this is how you scale the boss damage, and the range builds usually go for cold imbuement these days, especially because of the precision synergies. You do a lot of crit damage, you want to freeze the target and then you pump them. And poison imbuement doesn't really have any synergy here. It doesn't work with the precision crits, basically. Then there's also the victimized builds, like Heartseeker right now. This can't even be imbued at all. And this leaves us usually with melee builds trying to do some damage with poison imbuement. And why do we use poison imbuement in a range build this time and not precision, for example? Well, we can scale it up quite a lot. And it actually turns out it works just fine. So we can have permanent poison imbuement thanks to the poison imbuement tempers that you can put on your jewelry these days. Here's poison imbuement plus 5 casts, for example. Another plus 5 casts, you can have 12 charges of poison imbuement. And you can put even more if you had a third ring here, or like a third jewelry slot. Where, for example, before that, you can actually temper this as well. Especially when you don't masterwork up your gear that much just yet. You can do this on all 3 pieces. Later on with the Starless, that doesn't work. But having like plus 4, plus 5 on each of those 2 slots makes it pretty comfortable already. So you shoot a lot of those poison imbuement arrows. And then we also have bursting venoms here that triggers these puddles. And whenever they trigger and you walk into them, you reset your poison imbuement and you have infinite charges. So you kind of just stand on the boss, you spawn those poison pools, and you have infinite poison shots. And you just like fire away, basically. So occasionally it happens that even with like plus 10 charges, this doesn't actually trigger. And then you just run out of poison imbuement. But you only have like a few seconds downtime anyway. And then you can press poison imbuement again, it's fine. But from my experience, that happens like maybe once every 10 runs or so. So not really too bad, where you just lose a few seconds of DPS basically. Overall, it's very consistent with this bursting venoms, especially in packs. You just shoot into a pack, you walk through them, there's like poison pools everywhere, you reset your poison imbuement, and you also have the backup poison trap that has the countering upgrade here with the 30% chance to reset your imbuement as well. So you can also throw this down, and sometimes when everything goes wrong, you still have this as a solution to reset your imbuement cooldown. So ultimately, all of our damage comes from the poison, and whenever you don't have poison imbuement, you don't deal damage. So this is something to be mindful about. And you also have to make sure that you activate close quarters combat, at least in this starters version here. Before that, it's more about you have to throw down a poison trap to activate exposure, because as long as the poison from the poison trap is ticking, this counts as affected by traps, for example, for this key passive here. But later on, when you don't play with exposure anymore, you have to make sure that you activate this every 8 seconds with either dash or shadow step. So this is also why both of these skills are included. Every 8 seconds, you usually want to do like a shadow step, for example, on the boss, so they activate this buff. Another neat addition for the late game is also Inner Sight. So Inner Sight was kind of unexpectedly buffed when Season 4 went live, which buffed this build actually to much more viability. So now it also fills up when you deal dot damage. That was not the case previously, and in general Inner Sight was really bad when you played it back on the PTR, for example, and in the past. So there was a surprising buff here, and now it actually fills up very easily, even on very high pit tiers, and it works with poison. So even when you don't play preparation, for example, you have Inner Sight, and sometimes you just get a full refill and you get 25% crit. And crit is actually pretty helpful, for example, here from the blended poison imbuement. Every time we crit, you do 75% multiplicative extra damage with our poisons. So this is very good. We actually want to have a bit of crit. Inner Sight is like kind of like your nuke window here. You also get a lot of extra crit, for example, from the Barrage itself. We have the advanced Barrage, that's 20% extra crit. So when this effect is active, you already get 45% crit just like that. And then you have a bunch of base crit, you have a bunch of crit on your gear, and you see you're actually going to cap out on crit, basically. You can get to like 100% with those effects active. There are also a lot of other poison synergies here. For example, on the Paragon tree, we have Eldritch Bounty, first of all, the extra 20% damage for attacking with imbued skills. And we have a bunch of glyphs here. There's the Bane glyph, 15% chance for double poison damage. That's very strong. And also Tracker, an even stronger glyph. So especially on the boss fights, you'll notice this one, 40% longer poison. So it just extends the dot and gives it effectively 40% extra damage over long periods of time. That's very powerful. We also have versatility here. Versatility also buffs poison imbuement with 50% extra damage. So this is a very powerful glyph to have here. And we have control, so when we stun or freeze enemies, we do extra damage. We can do that easily from our tempers. So you see this here on the chest piece, for example, chance to freeze, chance to freeze. You can do chance to slow, chance to stun. So you can activate all of these effects here, including Frigid Finesse as well. And here also efficacy, another really powerful glyph for poison. So like this, we have like a really strong Paragon board with really good glyphs. Down here is one that's a bit open to discussion. This is Ambush. So especially for boss fights, this is very powerful because you get an extra 10% damage boost. You can replace this with Exploit Glyph as well, especially for speed farming. I've tried that as well. So Ambush is more of like the kind of like bossing version and the, you know, higher push version basically. And Exploit Glyph allows you to activate your vulnerable very easily. So we get vulnerable from mostly a cursed touch. So we have this here, you shoot into a pack, you start applying this vampiric curse, and as long as they have it, they will be vulnerable. This is very important, not only for the 20% damage buff that you get from vulnerable by default, but also for the corruption aspect. So it has like a much stronger value than in other builds usually. And you want to have this vulnerable effect at all times. So when you're speed farming, you can go Exploit Glyph, but otherwise Ambush if you go for like higher tiers. Depends a bit on like how you feel versus bosses versus and compared to trash, for example. But otherwise you don't have to change anything on the Paragon board, and it kind of like has a lot of life, a lot of defenses here. You see this setup actually goes up to 59k life. It's a fairly tanky setup that I made here, but thanks to the Shaku you have a lot of life, for example. And we can put more on our other gear. We have a lot of ranks in Dark Shroud. There's a lot of defenses there. And like this, you're going to be pretty tanky. So here you can go up to like rank 17 Dark Shroud, for example, giving you like 80% damage reduction when you have 5 of them or so. This makes you quite tanky. And you kind of need it because when you go high in the pit, and you fight those bosses as a barrage, you have to usually like stand right in their face. Basically, you have to take some hits. And same with packs, like sometimes you just have to shadow step into a pack because there's a suppressor or there's like a champion, and you can't really reach them if you just shoot into a pack. So you have to sometimes really dive in and be very tanky. So we do this with a lot of life and the Dark Shrouds, and those are getting generated from the Umbers aspect in this build. For the rest of the setup, we have a bunch of really powerful offensive and defensive buffs here. So I mentioned Corruption aspect already. We also have Retribution when we stun enemies, which again we can do from the Tempers, or when a staggered boss is present, then you do more extra damage here. We have the Accursed Touch for the vulnerable. We have High Velocity and Branching Volleys, the two barrage aspects. I put Branching Volleys here on the neck, so it has like a much better AoE capacity. I tried it on a normal slot, but with the pit monsters being pretty tanky, it definitely felt a lot better having it on the neck, just so you have like this good AoE damage as well. And then you just need to take down the boss somehow. And here's the starter skies. So this is actually exactly the setup that you run in all of the versions of the guide. If you don't have starter skies, we have an extra basically defensive power here. So for example, there's Undying early on. This is something that gets replaced later, because once you have good gear, you don't really need Undying anymore. We do have Siphoning Strikes, we have a lot of lucky hits, usually in close range, so you heal just enough with this. Once you are tanky enough, so you don't really need that anymore, but Undying makes it kind of easy. And for example, in the earlier versions of the guide, you have Umbers on the neck instead of the Branching Volleys, because you won't really need all that damage output early on until you go very high in the pit. So using the starter skies is basically a straight upgrade to the resource economy and to the damage of the build, because we just replace Undying, and then we have also extra tankiness here once you get the Harlequin crest. For the stats on your gear, one stat is very important. Besides the poison imbuement that I mentioned, you want to have those extra poison imbuement casts, but then also damage to crowd controlled enemies, at least in the endgame version here with close quarters combat. Before that, you actually temper different stuff. Just percent damage is actually what you're looking for. So this is also one of the natural finesse tempers that you can put. The thing about percent damage is that for dots it applies twice, so it double dips. This is true as far as I know for every single dot in the game, and this is just how it works. So for some reason this number is times 2, so this 65% is actually 130, and likewise here on the weapons, for example, likewise here. There is also, for example, a stat damage over time. You have this here, for example, on the bow. Damage over time has exactly times 2 the values of percent damage, so you can also roll damage over time. It makes no difference really, besides your arrows deal slightly less damage, but they're not really so important. It's all coming from the poison imbuement anyway, so you can have one or the other, whatever you have a better roll of basically. But for your tempers, you want to go to percent damage, and then later you have to replace your gear and put damage to crowd controlled. This is important for the close quarters combat passive. It's also fine if you get damage to crowd controlled on a really good weapon and you may not have starter skies yet, then just keep it, I guess, and wait until you can do the swap later. It's not worth, like, you know, taking like a really powerful item and then temper die hard for this percent damage roll. If you happen to get crowd control, then just keep it until you get this setup later. Other than that, we want to get a bunch of crit chance, a bunch of movement speed, a bunch of attack speed, so we're going to have like a good mix between all of these, a bunch of dex as well. You can have that on a few items. So the setup here runs like around 1500 dex in the endgame version, which is pretty nice. And you also need to get a bit of extra resources here. So for example, you see on the chest we have energy per second here. You can also put it on boots, and you can even put it on helms if you really want to. So this is probably a bit too try hard with what I put here, just to be on the safe side for this earlier version of the build, where you have like over 20 energy per second, so you can basically just spam barrage almost no matter what. But later on you won't really need that much investment into this. So basically once you go to start this version, we have just one roll energy per second I have on a chest, and that was actually fine. I didn't even need the boots here, and it was actually working really well. So you can experiment with the min-maxing a little bit. Depends also like how much you masterwork your gear, because those values go up when you have more masterwork gear. But 1 or 2 energy per second rolls, in addition to all the other stuff, are really helpful to make this whole thing work. And similar for your bow or for your crossbow, so we want to have resource cost reduction here. I just put like a normal resource cost reduction roll, and was actually fine once I had the full setup. So previously I actually had like for example a greater affix here. This was kind of like a priority for the resource cost reduction, but again, depending on how much you invest into energy per second and how much you use, for example, Thibaut's Will and Aftermath, and how much lucky hit you have maybe for innovation and so on, you may not need to go that ham on resource cost reduction on your bow. And instead of, for example, the 32% roll, something like a 19%, just masterworked up, no crits, no great affix. This was actually fine for me in the end. So the resource economy got a bit better later with the Starter Skies, and once I had the full setup figured out. And lastly, for your weapons, you want to have the chance for Barrage to cast twice. You can get up to 100% by just having good rolls on this on all of your weapons without any masterwork crits. So you can just masterwork everything to 12, for example, and you will have the 100%. There's no need to go over 100%. You don't get a third arrow or something like that. So depending on what your rolls are, this is like a really high priority start. You want to try to get to 100% or as close as possible. So for example, if you happen to not temper a perfect roll on all of your items, which is quite likely, then it's also really good to just get a masterwork crit on them, so they get closer to the 100% at least. But in the optimal version, you don't need that, and you can put your master crits on other slots. And that concludes the guide. So I hope you enjoyed this. Again, if you have like a low level rogue and you want to follow the full progression starting on level 50, then go check out the max roll guide to Death Trap Rogue. So this is one I wrote before season start, and now I've been min-maxing it more, and I'm having a blast with this build, especially with the Starter Skies version, the final version of this build. There are still some little tweaks that you can do. You see here, for example, I have concealment on my bar. I really like having concealment on hardcore instead of, for example, I have the caltrops in the guide. So I kind of felt like a lot safer with the concealment. So there are some little choices you can make like this. But overall, I'm really enjoying this build. I will be farming with this for a while. And it actually just turned out so much better than I had anticipated once I actually got the full setup. So I'm very glad about this, and I'm having a ton of fun. So I hope you're going to enjoy this guide and this build as well, especially once I have those Uber Nicks. It feels great. So let me know what you think about it when you play it. And otherwise, hope you liked this video, and I'll see you guys next time.